Okay. Namaskar. On behalf of the Bhandarkar Institute, I'm happy to be present here and to welcome Professor Mislav Jezic. He is going to give a lecture on the occasion of the Bori centenary year. You must have attended many more lectures previously, and we'll be conducting many more ahead. Professor Mislav Jezic will speak on the history of Sanskrit studies and Indology in Croatia. I welcome you, sir, for this lecture.
Thank you.
As a token of our respect towards the professor, we present him a book published by us. This is the one we were talking about.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I will just briefly introduce the speaker of today. Professor Mislav Jezic was born in 1952 in Zagreb. He graduated from the Zagreb Classical Grammar School and later graduated from the Faculty of Philosophy, Zagreb University, in Philosophy and Indology as two majors, and later in Linguistics major and Ancient Greek Philology minor as a parallel study. In 1978, he completed his MA thesis on modal verbs and auxiliary verb in the framework of Hindi verbal system. In 1983, he attained his PhD in philology with the thesis entitled Problems of Exegesis of the Rigvedic Hymns. He taught in various capacities at the Department of Linguistics and Oriental Studies of the Faculty of Philosophy at Zagreb. He was the head of the department from 1991 to 95, and he established the studies of Turkology, Hungarology, and the chair of mathematical linguistics there. He taught Indian philology. He gave lectures and seminars in Sanskrit, Middle Indo-Aryan, Hindi, ancient Indian literature, and Old Iranian, that is Avestan and Old Persian. And at the graduate level study of linguistics in Zagreb, he taught the course of linguistics and philology. He also taught Indian philosophy. He's an associate member of the Croatian Academy of Sciences and Arts, and since 2000, he is a fellow of the Croatian Academy of Sciences and Arts. In 2003, he became the honorary president of the Croatian Pan-European Union. He has many works to his credit, prominent being the Rigvedic Hymns, Sources of Indian Culture and the Indo-European Heritage, which is a monograph on Vedic myths, poetics, and ritual. It is a selection of hymns in Vedic and metrical translation with comments. The other one would be Thinking and the Word on the Being in the World, a collection of philosophical and philological studies. He's also brought out Rigvedic Upanishads, the original text of the Aitareya Upanishad, Kaushitaki Upanishad, and the Bhaskala Mantra Upanishad, and translation, introduction, commentary, and analytical studies on them. The Amaru Shataka is a monograph on the Kavya literature and Amaru's poetry, and Sanskrit text of the Amaru Shataka is included in this, with a metrical translation in Croatian with explanatory notes. In 2012, he received a felicitation plaque of the Akhila Bharatiya Sanskrit Sahitya Sammelan for his contribution to Sanskrit literature at the 15th World Sanskrit Conference, which was held in New Delhi. I request Professor to begin his lecture. Would you like to sit and speak? I'll put the mic here.
Maybe I can also bring this.
Whatever you please.
Let me see if I can put it here without. Yes, then I can speak also from here. don't. First of all, I would like to say that it is really an honor for me to have the opportunity to speak in the Bhandakar Oriental Research Institute about our Indology in Croatia. I'm very happy and even deeply moved to meet some colleagues whom I respect very deeply here among you, Professor Tite, Professor Bahulkar, and I would like to greet you all very cordially. I'm grateful to the young colleagues who have shown me today several different sections of the Bhandakar Oriental Institute. Thank you very much. And I would be very happy if in future my colleagues, our students, and possibly myself will have some opportunity to cooperate on some projects or on some scholarly tasks with the colleagues from the Bhandakar Oriental Research Institute. In Croatia, we could say Sanskrit courses started at my university in Zagreb in 1876. So it's over 140 years that Sanskrit has been taught at the Zagreb University. It was in the year when Zagreb University was reformed, modernized, and part of that modernization in 1876 was also introduction of Sanskrit courses. All scholars of Slavic studies, of Germanic studies, of Roman studies had to follow the Sanskrit course because you were not a serious linguist if you didn't know Sanskrit and if you could not master at least the basics of the comparative and historical linguistics at those times. Huh? However, maybe I could mention one personality that is most probably known to you, and in a way, he does not belong to directly to the tradition of Croatian Indology, but however, he was a Croat. The author of the first published Sanskrit grammar in Europe in 1790 was a Carmelite monk, Paulinus a Sancto Bartolomeo. His personal name was Filip Vezdin, and he was born in a Croatian family in Hof, in Lower Austria. But if you visit that village today and look at the cemetery, the names of inhabitants, they're almost all Croatian. Huh? So he came from a Croatian family, became a learned monk, and was sent as a missionary to the Malabar coast. He spent there 13 years, from 1776 to 1789, and after his return to Europe, and he returned in the first year of French Revolution, because the war between French and English started in India too. So in those changed circumstances, he came back to Rome and published the first Sanskrit grammar ever published in Europe, in Rome, under the name Siddharubam, which is obviously a usual name for grammars in Kerala tradition. 14 years later, he published his second grammar under the name Vyakaranam. It's a long name, Sive Locupletissima Lingue Samskrdamice institutio. And this second grammar was written according to the system in which Western grammars are written, so it was much easier accessible to Western scholars, and some of the first Sanskritists in Europe started learning Sanskrit from his grammar. Now, in 1804, then the first grammar of William Carey was published in English. In 1806 or 8, the grammar of Charles Wilkins and so on. Then, of course, other grammars came into use, and for most people they were more practical because they were in English, and Vesdin's or Paulinus grammar was in Latin. He wrote also some of the systematic books on India. One of them is Systema Brahmanicum, and his travelogue, Viaggio alle Indie Orientali, became a hit at the end of the 18th century. It was translated in a number of European languages and was a source of knowledge about India in that period. He is also important because he started a sort of comparative linguistic research in his papers on the De Antiquitate et Affinitate, Lingue Sendice, Sanskrdamice et Germanice Dissertatio. Well, a paper on the on the common origin, on the relatedness and common origin of the Sanskrit, Avestan, and German languages. Another paper he wrote on the origin of the Latin language and its affinity with Sanskrit, and so on. He composed relatively long lists of cognate words in these languages, and if you look at them today, well, in some cases he may failed, but in the most cases he was right. Those are really cognate words in Sanskrit, Avestan, Latin, Greek, Germanic, and so on. So, as the pioneer of Sanskrit studies and the pioneer of comparative linguistics, maybe he may be mentioned, although he was a Croat, but he did not work in Croatia, and he had not Croatian disciples who would continue his work. In the 19th century, there were some Croats that studied Sanskrit and Indology, like Imbrot Kalec, who finished his studies in Heidelberg, and some others, but the circumstances in the country were not ripe to introduce Sanskrit studies or Indology in Croatia. So it was not until, as I mentioned, 1876 that the courses in Sanskrit were introduced at the Zagreb University. The first professor was a Czech professor, Leopold Geitler, but all the following professors were Croats. And in 1959, the course of Sanskrit was expanded under the leadership of Professor Radoslav Katicic, who was my professor, who expanded it to a complete study of Indology, including Sanskrit, Hindi, Indian literature, and other subjects. Until today, we developed different aspects of Indology, and we cover, of course, Sanskrit and Hindi. We are giving seminars where we are reading Vedic texts with students, Sanskrit texts, Sanskrit epic texts, the darshanas, kavya, we are reading also Pali and Prakrit texts with our students. And those who are especially interested in Vedic have the opportunity to follow the courses in our department, the courses in Avestan and Old Persian. It's useful, it's very useful for Vedic. On the other hand, we have also lectures covering Indian civilization, Indian history, Indian literature. Courses in Indian literature are offered through 6 semesters. In Indian religions and in Indian philosophy. So from time to time other courses are also offered, for instance in Indian classical theater, Indian art and so on. For certain of these fields, my colleague, Lady Clara Göncz-Moachanin, has merits to have introduced them. She is a very good expert in Natya and wrote a book on it. And he also studied comparatively classical Indian theaters and some other classical theaters, European, and even some Asian theaters. Another young colleague of mine has made his dissertation in the methodology of, or methods of interpretation of the Vedanta commentators of the Shukla Yajurveda Upanishads, and compared different methods, and of course gave a survey of those methods introduced by the Purva Mimamsakas and of those methods introduced later by the Uttara Mimamsakas. So he's doing a very good work in Indian philosophy, Ivan Andrianic. Another colleague, Goran Kardas, is also working mostly in the field of philosophy, but predominantly Buddhist philosophy and especially the older Abhidharma texts. But let me return to the period when Indology was founded in 59-60. There was desideratum, so to say, to found Indology, but as it is often the case, the political and financial circumstances did not allow it very long. But then the professors of our university, first of all, Professor Radoslav Katicic, but also, I mentioned 2 other colleagues, used the moment when the non-alignment movement was started and argued that in this context we really need serious Indian studies. And so in that situation, political circumstances helped academic motivation to found such studies. Along with Professor Katicic, there was another professor of comparative literature who has merits in helping the founding of Indology. Just a moment. His name was Svetozar Petrovic, and shortly before those years, he spent 1 year in Allahabad and studied Hindi, translated a collection of Hindi short stories in Croatian, and actually he was maybe politically more influential than Professor Katicic. Professor Katicic was a great scholar, but never very strong in politics. But Svetozar Petrovic could help even from that side. And there was a third professor, Čedomil Veljačić, who wrote the first service of Indian philosophy in Croatian, who served before that time as a diplomat in Rome and in Bonn. He was not ambassador, but member of the embassy. Usually, his task was cultural relations. Čedomil Veljačić had the luck to listen to Giuseppe Tucci in Rome, and I suppose Paul Hacker in Bonn. It covers the period when Hacker taught there, although I could not find direct mention. So, at the first moment, Petrovic helped establishing Indology, but withdrew from the courses. Katicic, as an excellent Indo-European scholar in Indo-European linguistics, took over the main courses and became head of the chair of Indology, while for Čedomil Veljačić, a chair of Indian philosophy was opened at our Faculty of Philosophy, University of Zagreb. However, Čedomil Veljačić left Zagreb relatively very soon. He was sent to India to establish, well, here courses in Croatian or Serbian language, but in the end, very soon, he ended as a Buddhist monk on Sri Lanka under the name Bhikkhu Jnanajivako. He continued writing contributions, both in Croatian and in English, on Indian philosophy, but was no more in Zagreb. However, he influenced the next generations of young people in Zagreb and aroused a lot of interest for Indian philosophy. Professor Radoslav Katicic left for 1 year for the Alexander von Humboldt scholarship, and he spent that year in Tubingen and specialized in Sanskrit and Vedic philology under Paul Thieme. So that even in the recently published history of the department in Tubingen, he is listed among the pupils of Paul Thieme, and he really felt himself as a pupil later, all his life. He was an excellent professor, and he wrote a survey of but oh yes, it works again. Thank you. His survey of Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit literature serves even today as a handbook for our students. Of course, they have also to read handbooks in English, German, and other languages. But Professor Katicic's handbook is very useful and has very useful bibliographical data for every field of Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit literature. Until that time, until the 70s of the 20th century. Maybe I can mention one curiosity, although I'm not now speaking I'm not following properly the chronological order, but before coming to the current period after Professor Katicic, because Professor Katicic was, after some years, called to the Vienna University, and he continued teaching then at Vienna University. Before going to the period after Professor Katicic, I would like to mention one curiosity, which might perhaps be interesting for some of you. After Vezdin and before Tkalec, and of course before the introduction of Sanskrit to the Zagreb University, in 1820s, after the first books in Indo-European linguistics have been published, after the first works of Franz Bopp, Rasmus Rask, and other pioneers of the Indo-European grammar, discussion ensued among Slavic scholars because Slavic languages were not included in the comparison of Indo-European languages. On the other hand, well, maybe it's a part of the picture why Sanskrit was so important in Europe. The discovery of Sanskrit meant for those linguists who started studying Sanskrit, like, well, of course, some British scholars, but among the German scholars, Friedrich Schlegel, August Wilhelm von Humboldt, August Wilhelm von Schlegel, Wilhelm von Humboldt, and others, the discovery of Sanskrit meant that there is another classical language with enormously rich literature, cognate to our classical languages, Latin and Greek, but on the other hand, also the Germanic languages are cognate to it. In a way, the Romance languages were understood until that period as somehow very noble because they originated from Latin. Of course, from our perspective today, it may seem incredible, but the Germanic languages were not so respected. They were barbarian languages, and Romance languages had a very noble origin. But now, when the German linguists discovered that Germanic languages are akin to Sanskrit, well, it was a title of nobility, so to say, to be cognate, to have a language which is cognate to such a noble classical language as Sanskrit. And it became, well, one of the topics, very important topics of symbolical value in early German Romantism. And in that context, the Indo-European linguistics was developed. And in that context, it seemed now, well, all right, Romance languages are noble, now even German languages became noble, but Slavic languages are omitted. And actually, well, Slavic scholars recognize that obviously Slavic languages are also cognate with Sanskrit. We could say today, of course, Slavic languages are not more cognate than Germanic or Romance languages, but Slavic languages are far more obviously cognate. You can simply see it very, very easily. for instance, if you know Sanskrit, and if you read the Slavic numbers, of course, in English, 2, 3, 4, 5 is cognate with dvau, trajach, čatvari, pancha. But if you hear how it sounds in Croatian, dva, tri, četiri, pet, it's almost the same. Huh? Of course, tun in German or to do in English is cognate to Sanskrit dadhati. But in Croatian, it sounds djedem. And dadati in Croatian sounds dadem. It has even reduplication. Of course, he is, they are, is cognate to asti, santi, and so on. But in Croatian it is jesam, jesi, jest, asmi, asi, asti, and santi is su. So you have even the same epophony. Everything is preserved. Huh? Now, I will not go further into details, but some Slavic scholars engaged in the discussion are Slavic language at the beginning of the 19th century. Are Slavic languages cognate with? It's interesting that Philip Vezdin, although he was a Croat, did not compare Slavic. He did not. He was a Croat, it's obvious. Huh? And we know it positively. But he did not compare Slavic languages. However, in the 1820s, one Slavic scholar, Anton Mihanovic, was among the first who imagined a systematic way how to prove that Slavic languages are cognate to Sanskrit. He followed the lexicographers of several Slavic languages and came to the general conclusion that at least 2,000 verbal roots can be recognized in Slavic languages. And he said, if I can prove that 10% of those roots is cognate with Sanskrit roots, then I have proved that Slavic languages are cognate with, but it's impossible that you have 10% of cognate roots without if the language is not cognate. And he wrote in German an article, published it in Austria, where he presented 200 Slavic roots and compared them to Sanskrit roots. To be able to do that, he had to learn Sanskrit, he had to learn even Devanagari script to be able to use the dictionary of Horace Hayman Wilson, and he worked it through. And we can say today, maybe he was wrong in 30 cases. In all other cases, he was right. He found out real cognate words. And after that period, even German scholars included Slavic languages in the European comparisons. And what is maybe interesting, in Croatia, few people know that Anton Mihanovic studied Sanskrit and wrote a paper or an article on the relatedness of Slavic languages with Sanskrit. He is known as an important person in the Croatian cultural revival of the 19th century and as the composer of the Croatian anthem. So the composer of the Croatian anthem, the poet who composed the Croatian anthem, was a Sanskrit scholar. It's a strange curiosity, but maybe worth mentioning. Now, I'll come to the current situation, and I already mentioned to you that my colleagues are working in several fields. Maybe I should mention also the first collaborators of Professor Radoslav Katičić in the department and at the chair of Indology. It were two ladies, Professor Milka Jauk-Pinhak, who was concerned with the Indian Vyakarana, with the Prakrit languages, and with the history of Indology. Of course, she covered also certain, for the sake of seminars, other fields, but that is what she was writing about. The other lady, Professor Zdravka Matišić, on one hand taught also Sanskrit and translated the Tantrakhyaika into Croatian, and on the other hand was interested in the process of standardization of modern Indian languages, especially Hindi, but also other modern Indian languages. That was also the topic of her dissertation, and wrote and published a Hindi grammar. I mentioned already my colleague, Lady Clara Göns-Marjanin, who wrote on the Natya Shastra and Indian theater and on comparative topics. And on, well, different other topics. She also took active part in our, let us say, studies in Sanskrit epics, which I will mention in a moment. I mentioned our younger colleagues, Dr. Ivan Andrijanic, who also covers different fields, but his main contribution so far is in the field of the Vedanta philosophy, but seen from the methodological point of view, how the Vedantin commentators commented the Upanishads. And the other colleague, Goran Kardas, working in the field of Buddhist philosophy, especially the Abhidharma philosophy. In this moment, we have some doctoral students, and two of them are members already of our department. One of them is preparing her dissertation in the field of, well, let us say, Pali and Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. She is studying the development of Buddha's biography in the Pali Canon and in the Mahavastu. And the other young colleague, her name is Višnja Grabovac, and the other young colleague, Katarina Katavić, was an excellent student, studied Indology and German languages, but at the same time she was interested in some Oriental languages and studied Arabian and Turkish, and the Romani language. So she is preparing her thesis in history of Indo-Aryan languages with a special stress on the development of the Romani language. We have a Roma minority in Croatia, so it has also another actual, let us say, aspect. Another doctoral student who is not member of our department, I would not like now to describe how difficult it is to open any post, but we managed so far to open some of them at least. Well, another is preparing her dissertation on the commentaries of the Satasai. And we have some other doctoral students. I will not go in every detail now. I did some research work in the Vedic field. I published a monograph on the Vedic, on the Rig Samhita, and on the method of interpretation of the Vedic suktas. The main idea was that they should not be interpreted after the model after which many Western scholars tried to look, for instance, for Vedic mythology comparable to Greek mythology, with which, of course, Westerners are very acquainted. The point is that Vedic mantras do not expand any mythic stories. If somebody wants to look for mythology in that sense, in India, yes, one can find it in the Indian epics and in the Puranas, but not in the Rig Samhita. And in the Rig Samhita, we can find poetic formulations about the, let us say, invisible truths, which they were able to recognize, or they had insights into that actually invisible truths. And the formulations are very often enigmatic, and you should solve the riddles, so to say. If you try to read the texts, as you all know, literally, you will not come to a coherent meaning of the hymns. But if you manage to solve the enigmatic expressions, you will come to a very coherent and sometimes very deep meaning of the Rigvedic hymns. And that's what I tried to show, how this is done, how far you must understand the text linguistically, but how far you must also understand the composition of hymns and allusions, and sometimes even phonetic allusions in certain cases, sort of cryptophony. So it's a very challenging subject, but that is one field in which we made research. Another, in the last more than 10 years, we started working on the Upanishads, and we paid attention to the, of course, structure, but also history of texts. And sometimes it's very rewarding. Well, one example which is relatively obvious, when you read closely the text is, let us say, in the Kaushitaki Upanishad, in the third Adhyaya, man's faculties are described, but in the first passages, only 5 pranas are mentioned. And then at once, from passage 5, you have all the, let us say, to be short, buddhindriyas and karmendriyas, as they are mentioned in the later Sankhya system. They are not called buddhindriyas and karmendriyas, they are called prajna matras, but the list is complete. So obviously there was a change in tradition. There was an innovation in the middle of the third Adhyaya. And only the third Adhyaya gives reason to introduce such content, not the first and the second. But at the end, at the very end of the second Adhyaya, you have also mention of all the indriyas, let us say. And at the end of the first Adhyaya, you have also mention of all the indriyas. There are philological reasons to believe that the expansion of the third Adhyaya influenced first the conclusion of the second Adhyaya, and thereafter even the conclusion of the first Adhyaya, and now you have a new unity of the text, but that unity is the result of a of the text history. And even in the second and first adhyaya, it gives a deeper meaning to the conclusions of those adhyayas, but obviously there was no direct reason to introduce it in those adhyayas, and in third, it was obviously the reason. So that's just one example, how we are trying to recognize when it is philologically well-grounded, traces of the history of those texts, and sometimes we also find that history was interconnected, that one text influenced the other, and that is very helpful for relative chronology. The third field where we are doing research are the Sanskrit epics. And on one hand, we did research in the field of the Mahabharata, but there, at least the colleagues, the researchers from Zagreb University studied more the didactic parts, the Bhagavad Gita, the Anugita, the Moksha Dharma Parvan, less the narrative parts, but our colleague Clara Göncz-Moachanin studied also the structure of the Sabha Parvan in the Mahabharata, for instance. And in the case of the Ramayana, we tried to study from a less detailed perspective, from a, let me call it now, bird perspective, the structure of the Ramayana. Most scholars accept that books 1 and 7 are younger than the rest. Many scholars noticed differences between the Ayodhya Kanda and books 3 to 6. There was a long debate concerning the question, were they composed at the same time or at different periods? I will say only one thing. We noticed that the structure of the books 3 to 6 is very different from the structure of book 2, and the structure of the book 2 does not really fit in that structure. However, it's obvious, and nobody would deny it, that only the whole books 2 through 6 at least, if not 1 through 7, made Ramayana such a unique success in the world literature. So it's not a question of not appreciating the Ramayana as a whole, but we found out that in books 3 through 6, the story of the Ramayana expounds in a very elaborated way a myth that is basically identical, or at least basically very cognate, has the same meaning as a Vedic myth, the Vala myth. So Jacobi meant it was the Indravartra myth, all right, it's very close, but actually it is the Vala myth. And I could go into great detail, but this is not the occasion for that. But what maybe could be said briefly is that the role of Hanuman in those books is comparable to the role of Sarama in the Sarama Sukta in the Raksanghita. And not only that you can compare details as far as Sarama Sukta has details, but there is always something corresponding in the Ramayana to it, but even the verbs used, even in the expressions, the verbs used for the action of Hanuman when he jumps over to Lanka are the same verbs, the same roots used in the Sarama Sukta. So for jumping, Ramayana uses the roots pat and plu. And those very roots are used in the Sarama Sukta for the moment when Sarama jumps over the river Rasa and comes to the Panis. And when Hanuman jumps over the sea to Lanka, he must overcome several obstacles, and one of the monsters on his way is called Surasa. So to say, the composer of the Ramayana was very probably conscious of the parallelism. I don't think we have found something that the composer of the Ramayana did not know, but maybe we found something what he knew and we did not know. So that is shortly what we are doing in our Croatian Indology today, and I would like also to mention that we started organizing with our colleagues from all over the world regular conferences on the Sanskrit epics and Puranas. And the next conference will take place this September in Dubrovnik. The name of the conference is Dubrovnik International Conferences on the Sanskrit Epics and Puranas. The abbreviation is DICSEP. So DICSEP 8 will take place this September. I would use the opportunity to invite our dear Indian colleagues, if somebody among you is interested and can come to Dubrovnik, it will be a great pleasure for us to welcome you there at that conference. I shall leave, of course, this circular to the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. And I shall leave also 2 volumes of the proceedings of our Dubrovnik conference. There are 5 volumes, but I could not carry that much. So this is the last published volume, and this is one of the previous volumes. In these volumes, you have also contributions concerning our analysis of the Ramayana. In other volumes, there are other topics. So I would like also to present it to the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. And, well, with Professor Tite, I even discussed earlier about these publications. I apologize that we did not send them earlier, but now is a good occasion, I hope. And we can send the rest if there is interest in the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. Well, with this invitation, I would conclude my presentation for today. We are trying to do good research in Croatia. We are certainly among those Indologists who believe that it is very good karma and that they had luck to work in the field of Indology. We are very happy to do that. We are always happy when we are in India, and I'm especially happy that I'm now in the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. Thank you very much. Well, actually, I only added to my monograph on the Rigvedic hymns, where there is a lot of passages, of course, translated, but I added 33 whole suktas, a selection. It's published, of course, in Sanskrit and in the Croatian translation, just as in my book on the Rigvedic Upanishads. The edition is bilingual, Sanskrit and Croatian translation with a relatively extensive introduction and commentaries. And I don't know when we shall manage to translate the whole Rug Samhita. At this moment, I'm collaborating in the translation of the Rug Samhita, but in German, with Professor Michael Witzel and Professor Toshifumi Goto. There is a much better chance that it will be published in German before than in Croatian. But we would like, certainly. Thank you for the question. Well, I would say I want to be optimist. I see a lot of enthusiasm in Croatia and in other European countries. I know that there are problems. I know that for financial reasons, some departments of Sanskrit or Indology have been closed in the last decades. And it's always a loss if we think of the departments that were closed in Netherlands, one of them in Berlin and some others are maybe in danger in Germany. One asks oneself, are the authorities in such countries aware how important Indology and Sanskrit studies and so on were for their own culture, and how much they contributed to their own renown in the world? There is a general question: will the Western world turn simply into a great market without culture, or will it remain well, civilized part of the world with its really rich heritage, which should be preserved and developed? And to that heritage, Indology belongs as a very important, just as classical philology belongs to it, and even classical philology is in danger in many parts of Europe. It is incredible. One would say, with the creation of the European Union, what connects, what links all European nations? Greek and Roman heritage. Well, national heritages are valuable. They enrich the European culture, but that which connects us are Greek and Roman heritage. On the other hand, of course, that is the to cultivate the interest in the, let us say, most cognate and comparable cultures, and that's where the Sanskrit heritage and the Indian culture belong. I would say in this moment, I hope there is no danger for the future of Indology in Croatia. But you never know. We had already some periods when the deans of the Faculty of Philosophy did not have understanding for the value of Indology. And I'm very sorry to say their reasons were personal and political, not cultural nor academic. And I hope that there are ups and downs, but if there will be Europe, there will be Indology in Europe. If you hear one day that there is no Indology in Europe, it means that Europe is no more. So we shall fight for that. Yes. Well, I would say, and of course it is an open debate, I don't want to impose any opinions, but I would say, and maybe I can remind you of what I even mentioned in my presentation. To understand the epic and Puranic literature, it is inevitable to take the Vedic heritage into account. And on the other hand, certainly, there are elements in the epic and Puranic literature that preserve great antiquity, which is sometimes probably not so clearly preserved even in the Vedic corpus. So, for instance, if that may serve as an example, in the Rig Samhita, you have only one complete and two fragmentary hymns in the praise of Parjanya. The main god in the pantheon of the Rig Samhita is Indra. He's normally always called Indra. Now, in the Harivansha, in the Vishnu Purana, and in the Bhagavata Purana, myth of the Krishna raising the Govardhana is told. It's a myth about the conflict between Krishna and Indra. But in the moment when Indra starts gathering clouds and creating a great tempest, at once Indra is in Vishnu Purana, Bhagavata Purana, Harivansha called Parjanya. How could somebody come to the idea that Indra is Parjanya after so many, not centuries, millennia? Incredible. But obviously it is an element of great antiquity. Or, that is an example from the Atharva Veda, when Atharva Veda preserves also very great antiquity. not for the first moment I thought it's also in the epic literature, but I'm not sure. In Atharvaveda, in the hymn to Earth, the husband of Earth is Parjanya. That was the association, but it is in the Atharvaveda. Now, in comparative mythology, which developed since the 60s of the 20th century, especially thanks to some great Russian scholars like Vladimir Nikolaevich Toporov and Ivanov, but I know he's Vsevolodovich, but the first name is, it will come. So Ivanov and Toporov discovered a number of parallels and a number of Indo-European formulae in the Slavic oral poetry of all Slavic nations with cognates to the Vedic formulae. Their work was marvelously continued by Professor Katicic. He published, well, already, he published first a great number of articles in German in Wiener Jahrbuch für Slavistik, and thereafter he published already 4 books in Croatian where he synthesized this research in the reconstruction of Slavic sacred formulae from the pre-Christian times, and as he says clearly, he would never be able to discover that had he not studied the Vedas under Paul Thieme in Tubingen. So without the Vedic corpus, it would be very difficult to have comparative material to recognize this is old in Slavic formulae. I would say the Vedas are often the key to understand later Indian literature, especially sacred texts like the Puranas, even like the Tantras. On the other hand, they can also be key for understanding, for recognizing traces of similar traditions in other branches of Indo-European peoples where no corpus of sacred poetry has been preserved, but traces have been preserved and can be recognized with the help of that. So on one hand, I would say, in some cases, later texts like the Puranas can help us really to understand better even the Vedic texts. But as a rule, the Vedic texts are far more helpful to understand the later Indian texts, the Puranas, and even the Tantras. And many elements in the Kavya and so on, of course. I would say that Pischel and Geldner noticed many lines of continuity, but maybe they, in some respect, were not quite correct in projecting the later relations into the Vedic corpus. As I mentioned earlier, reading the Vedic hymns, it seemed to me so important not to interpret the mantras in this, not looking, for instance, for the mythology, like the Greek mythology in them. And if you project Puranic texts into Vedic, you will read mythology comparable to the Greek mythology, where there is no such mythology, where there is something very different. Formulas about the invisible truths and not stories. So that would be wrong. But in certain cases, very old contents and even formulae can be found also in later literature. In these cases, it's very legitimate to use the epics and the Puranas to complete the picture which we have from the Vedas. But in almost all the cases, as a rule, it's inevitable and very useful to use the Vedic texts and our understanding of the Vedic texts to understand better the tradition that evolved in those later texts, like the Vedas and Puranas. So, on the whole, I would say people like Abel Berghegne, Heinrich Lüders, Paul Thieme were more right than Pischel and Gendler. But Pischel and Gendler have also their share of being right. Thank you.
Some of us are fortunate to have listened to some of the speeches of Professor Jezic and some papers which were equally informative and interesting as his speech today. And it is really astonishing that amongst all kinds of political turmoils throughout the century, the Indologists and Sanskritists in particularly Eastern Europe and the old Yugoslavia, so to say, have really continued, and they hope to do their work to a greater scale. Let us see what unfolds when the new political trump card is being played just now. So, we are thankful to Professor Jezic. Tomorrow, there shall be a lecture by Professor Kenneth Zisk at the University Hall of the Center of Advanced Study in Sanskrit, and that will be on physiognomy, a comparative study of the European and Indian physiognomy. That lecture will be held at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. All of you are welcome there. I thank also the audience and the participants in the discussion. I thank the media for their publicity to this lecture. And also, I thank Dr. Vijay Bedekar and his team from the Vidya Prasarak Mandal Thane for converting this particular lecture into a webinar, and also the listeners to those webinars. Thank you.